Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to another episode of Muslim World in Focus. I'm your host, Dawood Sarfraz. My guest today is Peter Oborne, who is a world-renowned and award-winning journalist. He was the chief political columnist at the Daily Telegraph before resigning in 2016, and he currently writes for the Middle East Eye. Peter is also a best-selling author who has written several books, including The Assault on Truth, and the book we'll be discussing today, which is The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. Peter, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Peter, it's a great honor to be having this conversation with you today. Given the tragedy that is unfolding in Palestine, I thought it would be a very timely conversation because as I read your book, I really found that it lays the groundwork to understanding some of the double standards we're seeing in the West today. So I have several questions that I want to ask specifically about the book. But Peter, before I even get there, the first kind of question I had, it was just how difficult it was for me here in Canada to get my hands on your book. I couldn't find a copy, like a hard copy in any of the major bookstores. Amazon Canada, I could see is shipping from somewhere far because it was taking months to get here. I checked my university library. I think I mentioned it's the largest library in Canada. Interesting enough, they had every single other of your books except this specific one. So in the end, I had to order it from the UK. And I don't know, I thought maybe just speaking about why you think that is the case.
Well, what the book does do is to challenge the dominant narrative about Islam, about Muslims, and in particular about the so-called Clash of Civilizations thesis, which became the dominant thesis after 9/11 and the end of the Cold War before that. And it challenges the language used about the Muslims in Britain and the United States and in Canada. It really looks at these terms of radicalization, extremism, and so on. It takes apart, I like to think, the think tanks, the transatlantic think tanks, which have created a kind of discourse about British and American, Canadian Muslims, and that didn't make it very popular. So it was almost completely ignored, actually, in Britain when it appeared, and it's been ignored in the United States. Not everywhere. I've had some really nice. The Georgetown University gave it a wonderful reception. John Esposito, who I'm sure you're aware of, gave it a lovely reception. And a number of British academics, and also I've had approaches to have it translated into Arabic, into Turkish, now into Urdu, I think, and so it's getting a really lovely reception around the world. But in in Britain, United States, Canada, presumably Australia, no, not less so.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to work to make sure that actually is in the book, in the libraries, because I feel it's an important part of the overall conversation to have. So Peter, just turning to your book, again, I have several questions that I want to ask you today. And I want to just start off, Peter, with just this amazing parallel you make in your book between the U.S. Cold War strategy against communism and the current rhetoric, strategies, policies towards Muslims and Islam and Muslims. Can you share with us some of the key features that helped you make this connection between the two?
It's absolutely fascinating and true that the Western policymakers, both in the United States, Britain, and Canada, all modeled the approach to Islam and to Muslims after the end of the Cold War, and in particular after 9/11, on the way in which they had actually fought the threat of what they saw as a threat of Russian communism and communists at the height of the Cold War half a century earlier. In Britain, there was an organization called the IRD inside the Home Office with very much of intelligence contacts. And that divided the Muslim community between good and bad Muslims. It sort of drew a dividing line, and It wanted to get messages across. So you were allowed to have certain political opinions about social democracy, but then you couldn't go any further towards being pro-communism. And the same thing was happening in the United States, and a completely fabricated language was invented. The most famous in Britain is Encounter magazine, edited by Stephen Spender, who was a great poet, but actually it was funded by the British security establishment and the CIA. And it was there in order to fend off communism, although it was pretending that it was an independent magazine. And I outlined how that was done in the UK. Now there are all kinds of equivalents. You have Muslim Voices who appear to be independent but absolutely are not. They're funded by the state. They're funded actually by the Home Office and ultimately by British intelligence. And and then there's a second category of Muslims who are actually barred from the public sphere. They're not allowed to go on mainstream outlets, and the British state won't deal with them. In Britain, the most significant or largest victim of this, and I think it's outrageous and it's stupid, is the Muslim Council of Britain, which is put into sort of almost pariah, very much into pariah status. So bodies which are regarded by most Muslims as wholly mainstream, they're not in any way terrorists. They're not trying to sort of blow up Whitehall or anything like that. They're simply giving a language and an identity or a way of Muslims coming together politically, have been taken out of the British public sphere. Obviously, the problem has got a lot worse, a lot tighter, a lot sort of more dangerous, I think, since the events in Gaza over the last 3 to 4 months.
Yeah. And Peter, you mentioned quite a number of those terms that you kind of outline in your book as well. You just mentioned the word terror and terrorism. You mentioned in your book, you mentioned radicalism. And, reading your book, Peter, made me understand the significance of these types of terms and labels in trying to create certain narratives and even thoughts or ideas in people's minds. But there was a specific term that you noted in your book and you wrote extensively about, and that was nonviolent extremism. And actually, you write, when you first introduced it, you said, though not recognized as such at the time, it was a significant moment in political history. Can you just explain to us the significance of that term?
Yes. So, nonviolent extremism is thought crime. That's why it's significant. In Britain, we've always had we've been a very tolerant country. We've allowed people to express views, however heretical they may be. One example, say, is some chap wants to advocate a caliphate. There's no reason why he shouldn't. Actually, I personally, having studied Islamic history, have come to the conclusion that a caliphate worked many ways much better than the modern nation state. I mean, and there's a very serious argument to be made for that. But that is an example has become an example of nonviolent extremism. So if you go, it was very neatly done by Islamophobes who kind of captured the security apparatus in Britain, and this has been exported globally. We used to have a term which was called anything which inspires violence is against the law. Of course, it must be. If I'm stirring up hatred or worse against anybody, minority person, a politician, whoever it might be, that is against the law, and I should be taken to account, of course, and punished for it. What I should not be is if I express a heretical view. I support Palestine is the one at the moment. That is a heretical view, and it takes you very close to the edge of criminality. And I think that the term nonviolent extremism is full of problems because it is based on a spurious form of science, which holds that there is a journey which the potential terrorist goes on from being a moderate Muslim to being a radical, i.e. a dangerous Muslim. And that journey is called radicalization. And at the end of that journey, a number of people will go off, according to this doctrine, into terrorism. There's no serious evidence for it, by the way. That we explore in the book the science or the so-called research which lies behind it. It doesn't work. In fact, I think that the opposite is the case, that it is desirable that anybody, we'll forget about Muslims for the time being, anybody should get involved in politics. If you feel passionately about something, you should be able to campaign for it, make arguments for it, stand for parliament on it, whatever it may be. But it's been deemed that there are things which Muslims may not do, one of which, the contemporary one, is Palestine, the one, where if you do that, you're now being looked at by the state, you're seen as suspicious. And this is a grave attack on ancient British and Western liberties. It's one of the ways in which the war on terror has twisted and damaged what we are as countries. We stand up for freedom of speech, the rule of law, pluralism, the standing up for the underdog, rights of minorities. These are all the glorious things which Britain and countries such as Canada and the United States do claim to stand up for. But this is under attack by the creation of a new form of state-sponsored thought crime. Communism, by the way, I was brought up in the Cold War, and there is no question that there was a genuine threat to the existence and to the liberties of the West from Soviet communism. You just had to look at the structures of the Soviet state and the millions of people who had been murdered by the Bolsheviks, and to think or to accept that communism was a real menace, existential threat to the West. This is not true of Islam or Muslims. Yet the policymakers and intellectuals have created a series of structures which have framed Muslims as a threat to the West in the way in which communism was 50 years ago. And I don't think they're comparable. I mean, they're not comparable. I mean, no Muslim country, for instance, has ever been at war with the West, a cloud war in the West. And, we were at war, a very dangerous Cold War with Soviet Russia for half a century. And indeed, it is based on a series of false assumptions about that religions are at war with each other. It comes from particularly Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. In fact, I spent a lot of time reading the Quran, studying Islamic theology as well as Christian and Judaism theologies. We all worship the same God. The similarities between these three monotheistic religions coming out of the Middle East are much greater than the differences. And indeed, if you go back into history, you will see that very often it's been the Muslim states, the caliphates, which have been far more tolerant of rival other religions than, say, Christianity has been. I mean, the classic case is, of course, 1492, the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from the resurgent nationalist Spain, the emergence of, and where did they go? The Jews went off into North Africa, into the Ottoman Empire, and were absorbed and looked after and lived free and very creative lives. Or look at Granada, the famous Muslim states in southern Spain in the Middle Ages.
It was very interesting also in your book, Peter, how you talk about this coming together of the left and right in the Western political spectrum in terms of their animosity towards Islam and Muslims. And the examples you gave were interesting as well. You mentioned Macron from France and Cameron, who was the previous British Prime Minister and now the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, how when these leaders first came into office, relatively they had positive views towards Islam and Muslims. But over time, or probably very quickly, their opinions towards Muslims began to shift, and they adopted more of the far right and neoconservative rhetoric and views. Why do you think that's the macron
I hadn't thought about that, actually. Cameron and Macron had the same trajectory. I mean, Macron campaigning for office did so in very pluralistic terms, standing up for France's very substantial Muslim minority. The same with David Cameron, when he ran for office in the noughties. But then once in power, what changes? In Britain, you can point to the very substantial power of the Murdoch press, which and other British newspapers which engage in the kind of McCarthyism, anti-Muslim rhetoric, which I have and simply fabrication of false stories about Muslims, which I set out in great detail in the book. And also, I think there's the internally within the political machine, the importance of think tanks, which I try to show, which obscurely funded think tanks, funded by who knows who nevertheless get deep inside the political process and shape policy as well as public opinion. And then, of course, there is which is a new thing in relatively new thing in our politics in the West, and it's tragic, is the return of bigotry as something which drives public sentiment. And I put all three of those together, and it's creating a hostile environment for Muslims. And politicians like David Cameron, any politician, Macron, even Obama, you mentioned earlier, find themselves, although they're naturally by instinct liberal, they simply conclude that in order to win elections, they need to play into these very divisive tropes and ugly rhetoric adopted by the far right.
The scale of the intricacy between the media and these organizations that fund these think tanks, and then the revolving door between some of these people that work in the think tanks and the government, it was almost dizzying, like just seeing the interconnections and the amount of money, Peter, that is involved in all these. Like every time, like millions upon millions of dollars being thrown at nefarious actors and just people who claim to be experts.
Yes,
it's a great. I think you mentioned like it's almost like an industry that's been created.
I think it is an industry. I think there is an awful lot of money in it, and for legal reasons, really. I don't like to speculate too much about where that money comes from and who it is, but these are people with agendas which are deeply Islamophobic. We live in a democracy, the two of us, which is about embracing everybody and equal rights, but it is a new thing. I think it's come, and I don't know too much about Canada, but certainly in the United States and more in Britain, you are getting hugely rich people, often billionaires, buying political access, buying newspapers, buying think tanks, and using all of this to project essentially, I'd say, fascist agendas in many ways. And frightening agendas. And that sort of money lay behind the rise of Trump 10 years ago, and it's happening all the time. And I think it's taking over. It's one of the speakers say there was deep sorrow as somebody who really was a conservative, British conservative. I think it's taking over the British Conservative Party.
And then you also mentioned in your book, Peter, along those lines, how some of these values that we talk about, like in the French example, it's the example of laïcité. In England, you said the closest we really have is British values that are being talked about, and maybe here in Canada and the US, the Judeo-Christian foundation. That these are really being used now in a sort of weaponized way to attack certain groups of people, and in this case, mostly Muslims.
Yeah. I mean, the one I live, obviously, the sense I have, it's the one I know best: British values, which are beautiful things, because you can have because Britain is so expansive. You can have so many different identities. You can be Scottish and British, or Jewish and British, or English and British, gay and British, black and British, etc. And yet it's been recast very cleverly, and this comes from work carried out by think tanks. As British values are now turned into an exclusive thing aimed at foreigners or people from minority groups, above all Islam, by the way, who somehow don't fit into a more exclusive vision of what is essentially Englishness. There's a lot of white supremacy behind this, a lot of racism, a lot of prejudice, and it's getting worse and worse, this problem. I mean, we used to be able to rub along together, and there's a massive project to stop that happening anymore. And I think that's one of the great battles of our time. It's one of the what is is part of a bigger thing, which is the representative democracy, which was the thing which we were so good at and so proud of. In the 1930s, the liberal democracies standing together against authoritarianism in Europe, and that was. And now I think it is the liberal democracies themselves in some ways have become captured by authoritarian tendencies, and they themselves are becoming a threat to the liberal world order. One of the curious things about Muslims in Britain is they're much more British in many ways than almost anyone else. They have a much deeper understanding of what it means to be British, because Britain gives you so many possible identities. It doesn't make too many demands, and that is why, if you go to London, still it's a fantastic place to be, because you get so many different type nationalities, religions, and you name it, people of different colours, faiths. It's a glorious city for that reason. But there is a very serious attempt to, instead of having people being able to rub along together, to divide them and turn them against each other.
Peter, what are the things that you noted in your book that has led to this kind of, environment we are in right now, is the neoconservative movement. Mm-hmm. But what I found really interesting is one statement you made in your book, and I underlined it, was you mentioned that the neoconservatives and Al-Qaeda are locked in a death embrace. Can you explain what you mean by that death embrace?
Yeah, it's very... I thought very long and hard about this. Let's start off by defining neoconservatism. It is nothing to do with conservatism, despite its name, despite the fact that it is associated in particular with the Republican Party in the United States, and then it comes across to Britain. It's actually a revolutionary movement. It it is about power politics, and it dislikes truth, or rather, it wants to have its own truth. It dislikes institutions. It doesn't want to observe the rule of law. It supports torture. It supports. It's a sort of exceptionalist movement, and it rejects the historic teachings of representative democracy, conservatism, and it's a particularly racist attitude towards the Middle East. And to Islam, it regards as there are various different strands of neoconservatism, but Islam it will regard, generally speaking, as a malevolent, backward way of life or religion. Then now let's look at Al-Qaeda, which also has a misinterpretation of Islam, a very serious misinterpretation of Islam, namely that Islam is a religion of violence, as does ISIS. ISIS, you can read loads. These are not true, but oddly enough, they are. This analysis, the ISIS Al-Qaeda analysis of Islam, is shared by the neoconservatives in the United States. And this means that, oddly enough, they can work together because their worldview is almost exactly the same. And you find them in Syria and elsewhere. You have found the neoconservatives, the United States, working with Al-Qaeda to destabilize existing power structures. It happened also in Libya before the fall of Gaddafi, and it's quite murky, this territory. But it is become a sort of feature of the modern world, and what they both dislike is mainstream Islamic movements, including Islamist movements, democratic Islam. So. One of the episodes in recent history which was profoundly tragic was the Egyptian revolution, which brought down a US-backed dictatorship and installed, after successive free and democratic elections, Mohamed Morsi as Egyptian president for the Brotherhood. It was difficult to say who disliked Mohamed Morsi most. Was it Al-Qaeda or was it the United States of America? And in fact, America eventually ended up smiling on the coup d'etat, which brought him down, and that gave incredible power to Al-Qaeda, because they could say, look, these claims by the West that it supports democracy are completely fake. The moment that somebody comes along who doesn't represent their interests, they get rid of him or her. And so, same story, of course, in Algeria. Same story with Hamas after 2000, after it won democratic elections in Gaza, Palestine, 17 years ago, and so on. And so America, the neoconservatives in America, are the best thing that's ever happened to Al-Qaeda, and vice versa. And that is what I mean by a death embrace.
Yeah, and since we're speaking about the Middle East, I want to turn our attention maybe a bit to what's happening now in Palestine, but more specifically draw insights from your book to help us understand just the Western government, in particular the U.S., because we're talking about the U.S., how they've responded to the atrocities being carried out by Israel. Because, Peter, in your book, you write about the significance of Christian Zionism in shaping the American vision of Islam in the Middle East. And you write in regard to Christian Zionism, and I'm quoting here, "This is a massively consequential subject that cannot be ignored away or explained away. The origins of this movement lie deep in the American psyche." Can you explain the significance of Christian Zionism in forming that?
I'll try and do my best. If you go back to the very beginnings of America, with the early settlers in the 17th century, they brought with them one book. That's the Bible. And really, the Bible was by far and away the biggest book ever in the history of the United States. Everybody could, and of course, they did tend to see themselves as the chosen people. They identified with the Israelites who took over, historic Palestine according to the Bible, and they felt they had been given, and this is quite explicitly set out by popular preachers, believed by presidents, even including Lincoln. There's a particular Christian antecedent to the Christian Zionists, a certain George W. Bush in the early 19th century, direct ancestor of two US presidents who advocated this. There's a strong tinge of anti-Semitism in it, because they didn't like the Jews, and they tended to like the idea of an Israeli state or an Israeli presence in the Middle East, because it got them out of America. And Christian Zionism developed an element of a strong element of dominant, pervasive eschatology about the end times, and that involved the return of Jews to Israel, and creating the conditions for the Messiah, for the return of Jesus Christ, and some various different, depending who you spoke to or which preacher you listened to, various different versions of the apocalypse, and that has become a phenomenally powerful presence in Christianity in the United States. And thanks to the rise of mass media in the post-war period, you've got a series of preachers who were possibly rather cynically appropriated by the Israeli leaders in order to bring them American support, the weight of the evangelical Zionist movements in the United States was probably much more important than American Jews in giving tremendous support to the early Israeli state.
Yeah,
that's what I try to. It is quite a astonishing story, actually. The story of, and it remains the case even now, despite the fact that Christians in East Jerusalem, in the old city, are constantly under threat, almost daily basis, from Jewish movements inside, who want their property essentially, or they get spat at, they get attacked. Christians in, but this is not something which really seems to affect majority opinion among Christians yet in the United States.
And it was interesting, Peter, how you mentioned at the point where the Israeli leaders and the government started to reach out and make connections with some of the preachers you mentioned. Specifically, you mentioned Jerry Falwell. It was very interesting when you mentioned how there were certain times where Netanyahu or others would do take certain actions, but they would not inform the president. At one time it was Reagan, at one time it was Clinton, but would let Falwell know what's going on.
Yeah, they used them as pressure points against the White House. And it really counts.
Peter, I wanted to just ask you as a journalist to help us understand maybe a little better just the blatant bias right now in Western media coverage. It's gotten to an extent where it's not even looks like they're trying to hide the bias anymore. I mean, recently in the ICJ example, the Western media outlets, I don't believe any of them provided coverage of the South African case, but the next day they did provide live coverage of the Israeli defense. The Intercept made an analysis of the skewed coverage towards Israeli narrative among leading US print media. It's the same in Canada, and I'm sure it's the same in the UK. The kind of emotive language they use for one, certain kinds of events versus the other kinds of events, depending whether it's Palestinian or Israelis. So again, just as a journalist, how do you explain this to laymen like us? Where is it coming from?
Yeah. No, I completely share your analysis. I mean, the Times of London, which is supposed to be a great newspaper of record, one of the most famous newspapers in the world, on the Saturday, the day after the ICJ ruling, which I think is a momentous event, and it effectively puts Israel on trial for genocide. I'm not saying that a genocide is going on, but the court found there was sufficient evidence to take the case forward, and it named individuals who had made genocidal comments, including the president of Israel. I mean, and then it looked into the evidence of what's actually the terrible things which are happening on the ground. The Times of London. The first reference to it on the Saturday was on page 42. That was the third page of the international section. It wasn't given much space either. The following day I looked, and there was nothing about it at all except an attack there was an article by the former business correspondent of the paper attacking South Africa for being, I think he's saying that it was anti-Semitic. And then you had the Daily Mail, which is the biggest mass market paper in Britain. It didn't actually cover the ICJ at all, but what it did do, it devoted a huge leader in which it denounced the judges for carrying out a show trial. And The Economist, which is very respectable kind of affairs, full of boffins, written really anterior people who talk like this, They calls it a show trial as well. They use the same language as the Daily Mail. The media coverage has been bent. Palestinians are dehumanized. The deaths of Palestinians don't count. They tend. Israelis, when they are killed, Palestinians die mysteriously. It's never you can structurally examine the differences. Now, you say also why this is happening, and it really puzzles me, and I deal with this in the book. What has happened? When I became a journalist, I was very starry-eyed about it. This is 40 years ago. I believed that our job was to be fair-minded and to tell the truth and to remedy injustice. But now I don't believe that at all. I believe that the job of the journalists are part of a ruling establishment, and that they are there to impose patterns of thought in the interests of very powerful men, and largely men, and institutions. And it's a terrible sadness. Anyway, I find it very hard now to get published in the mainstream press in Britain, even though I was for quite a long time a relatively successful sort of mainstream journalist. You see me on the BBC and things like that, and in columns on big papers. Not anymore. I do, but I'm much happier. I'm right for Middle East Eye, which I hope you will read.
Yes.
And one or two other outlets, none of which are mainstream. And so I think you have to understand that the press is not about telling the truth. It is it's about representing the interests of the powerful. And that's true, I'm sure, in the United States. I don't know about Canada. I have hopes that maybe you're better there.
No, it's not much better here. For a while, one of the main media outlets here leaked that they weren't even allowing their reporters to use the term Palestine in the reporting.
It's worse than Thierry Me. Yeah.
Speaking about the ICJ case and this case on genocide, I wanted to get your thoughts on that too, Peter, because there's a interview that Biden did, or a comment that he made that was very interesting, when somebody asked whether or not he holds Iran responsible for the recent killing of American soldiers, and he responded that I do hold them responsible in a sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it. Now, like you mentioned, there's a case right now going. I mean, it's not confirmed yet, but it is. They're finding that there is some evidence leading to it. Numerous organizations are talking about at least the crimes that are taking place and the ethnic cleansing that is going on. In your opinion and your thoughts, is the West complicit in the actions of Israel?
Well, Biden, he says he's holding Iran responsible because, so he thinks, they supply the arms to militant groups which attack U.S. forces. The Americans have supplied an awful lot of arms to Israel. In fact, Israel could not be doing what it's doing in Gaza. The atrocities, the slaughter of individuals, ordinary citizens, the mass destruction of civilian infrastructure, the killing of well over, it now seems, 10,000 children. I mean, we've all seen these horrific pictures. It's only possible, first of all, because Israel is supplied with arms by the United States, but also it gets diplomatic cover. So, for instance, America vetoed the ceasefire resolution before Christmas. And then, of course, it trashed, Joe Biden trashed the ICJ, as did Blinken, his Secretary of State, who said the ICJ case, even before the court had met, was meritless. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I can't judge whether or not the genocide is going on. The court will do that in due course. But you can certainly say, without being challenged, that the leadership and many powerful people in Israel, from the president downwards, have made genocidal comments. You can also see how those comments have turned into the language of ordinary soldiers. We've all seen these horrendous videos, and there's no question there is genocidal language being used at the most senior levels of the Israeli political echelon, to use the jargon used there. And where does that leave President Joe Biden, who's now being called Genocide Joe? He may be that, I don't think he's been at all serious about dealing with this. All right, I like the fact that he's sanctioned 4 settlers. By the way, there's well over 4 settlers who are doing the most terrible things in the West Bank, and he's left alone, the settler leaders, the fascist politicians who govern them, who represent them, maybe would be a better word, in the Netanyahu cabinet. I would say that history may decide that Joe Biden has been complicit in genocide, the President of the United States of America. Of course, it won't be the first genocide the American state has been complicit in. In fact, if you go back to the 19th century, it kicks off with the genocide of the American Indians. But that is and I find it extremely troubling and upsetting, as somebody who comes from the West and used to respect America, to think that America can be doing the things it is doing today, and may well in getting involved in something quite as dark and as terrible as this. And the last thought, of course, we keep on saying that we're standing up for the values of the West, but Mr. Putin or Xi in China, etc., who we accuse of doing terrible things, we have zero moral standing. It's laughable. that we can say that we represent a rules-based order, etc. And so these, and I think I don't know what happens next. I mean, the people have been killed Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, hundreds of them every day. These awful things are happening to children. I mean, how can we? I don't understand how Western leaders live with themselves or sleep at night. I mean, I'm talking here about the Western leaders, let alone the Israeli ones.
Yeah. It's definitely heartbreaking, Peter. And it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to ask a very specific question from you as a journalist, Peter. Because, like you said, the scale of destruction, the death, the ethnic cleansing, all this that we're witnessing and pretty much live on our social media feeds, it's heartbreaking. But as a journalist, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts and your reaction when you see Palestinian journalists, the sacrifices they're doing to report. Journalists like Wael Dandouk and others who've lost family members, yet they're still working, and they've really captured the hearts of people around the world. But just your feelings and your thoughts as a journalist, because I'm sure it's different, given the similarities in your profession.
Yeah, they are the best of the best. They brought us. It's worth saying, of course, that these terrible images have not been brought us by Western journalists. There's always been this great conceit that Western journalists are the big guys, and they turn up in war zones and risk their lives apparently and tell the truth to the world. The truth to the world in this case has come from these guys and these women and men on the ground, risking their lives, not just their own lives, their families' lives, and being killed in very large numbers. I think it's more already in Gaza in 4 months than in the entire Vietnam War in terms of loss of life of journalists. And let's compare these people who wake up every morning knowing that they and their family might be dead so that they can bring the truth to the world of what's happening in Gaza, against these Western journalists sitting in well-paid studios, very well paid, making great bold assertions about this is the fault of Hamas and this is the fault of the Palestinians, and denying that genocidal statements are being made and playing down the atrocities of the Israelis, lying. There's a lot of examples of tamely accepting the lies which they are given by the IDF. There's plenty of that. And if you compare these Western journalists, all very well paid, completely safe, to the Palestinian reporters, many of whom are now dead, it's pretty grim.
Peter, you ended off your book with a passage from the Quran that I found really striking. You mentioned in the Quran, the passage that you had was, "O you who believe, if an evil lover brings you tidings, verify it, lest you smite some folk in ignorance and afterward repent for what you did." Why did you choose this specific passage to end off the book, and how relevant is it to today?
Well, I when I was researching the book, which took me a huge amount of time, and I had to really think. I spent ages talking to Muslims or visiting Muslim countries, in some cases going to war zones, and but above all, trying to learn what Islam was and represented, and who the Prophet was. And I felt I got to know him a little bit, just a little bit. And I got the sense of a person of enormous integrity. And that quote about truth, I thought it was aimed at all of us who try and tell the truth, and in some cases fail abysmally and culpably, to tell the truth. I thought his message, peace be upon him, was very profound and timely, actually, as well.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your time. I mean, again, there's a lot more that I wanted to discuss. The book was, again, just eye-opening, amazing. Great pity that it's so hard to find. I am making it one of my goals to make sure it is in every single library here, because I think it's really important part of conversation that overall that we're having. Thank you so much for your time, Peter.
Well, thank you. It was really nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Muslim World in Focus. The latest updates, you can follow us on Twitter at Muslim Focus and on Instagram at Muslim World in Focus. For any questions, you can email us at muslimworldinfocus@gmail.com. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.